When you think about the big players in European history, um, Luxembourg probably doesn't jump right to the front of your mind.
Right. It's small.
Yeah, exactly. But this little country, smack bang in the heart of the continent, it has this amazing story, resilience, influence. It really punches above its weight.
It does. 1,000 years of history meeting. A very modern, dynamic present.
And that's what we're diving into today. We've pulled together a bunch of sources to kind of explore that journey with you.
Yeah, our mission, if you like, is to unpack that millennium of history, give you a shortcut to understanding Luxembourg's, well, pretty significant role in Europe.
From medieval fortress to prosperous modern state. That's the arc.
That's it. And we'll touch on some key themes: resilience, adaptability, union, diversity, all crucial to its story.
Okay, let's unpack this. 1,000 years for somewhere so geographically quite small. It's fascinating. And it all kicks off, the sources say, 963 AD, Count Siegfried.
That's the traditional starting point. He acquires this spot called Luxembourg.
Bit of a mouthful.
Yeah, Luxembourg, on the Bach promontory. And that becomes the seed for Luxembourg City.
So that acquisition, right there on that cliff, sets everything in motion.
Pretty much. But, even before Siegfried, this area was important, strategically vital.
How so?
Well, think back to the Celtic tribes, the Treveri. They were settled along major trade routes connecting Gaul with Central and Eastern Europe.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
So it was already a crossroads, facilitating like cultural exchange, trade, technology.
And exactly, long before Luxembourg was a thing. Then, fast forward a bit, around the 1st century BCE, the Romans arrive.
Right, the Roman Empire expands.
And their impact was huge. The area becomes part of Gallia Belgica.
Which covers parts of modern Belgium and nearby regions, right?
Correct. And that brought military and economic importance. The Romans, famous for their infrastructure.
Roads.
Roads, absolutely. Connecting places like Arlon and Trier, really knitting the region into the wider empire.
Must have made a lasting difference to connectivity. And it wasn't just roads, was it? Sources mention settlements popping up, like Dalheim, Echternach.
And Roman law, the Latin language, all introduced. You can still find traces today, old Roman baths, villas.
Amazing, really, that layering of history.
It is. And that Roman foundation was important, because after the Western Roman Empire declines, around the 5th century, new groups move in.
Germanic tribes.
Primarily the Franks, yeah. And this marks the beginning of the feudal period. You get this blend, this fusion of Roman and Germanic customs shaping the early medieval landscape.
Okay, so we've got Celts, Romans, Franks, all contributing. Then, back to 963, Siegfried builds his castle. You said it was strategic consolidating power.
Definitely. The location was key. And from that initial foothold, the county of Luxembourg began to, well, gradually expand.
How do they manage that? Conquest.
Less outright conquest, more smart alliances. Strategic marriages were crucial. The early counts were pretty adept at navigating the very complex politics of the Holy Roman Empire.
The Holy Roman Empire, which wasn't really one unified state, was it? More like a loose network.
Exactly, a complex web. So the counts had to engage with neighbors, secure their position, and, slowly grow their territory. It required skill.
So lots of diplomacy, playing the medieval political game.
That's a good way to put it. They strengthened their autonomy through, well, careful legislation, managing their resources effectively, fulfilling their feudal duties.
That whole system of lords and vassals, loyalty and service.
Right. And by doing all this, the House of Luxembourg gradually increased its influence within the empire.
Which leads us, eventually, to Luxembourg becoming a duchy in 1354. That feels like a big step up.
Significant elevation, yeah.
What drove that? Just more clever marriages?
Well, the House of Luxembourg, tracing back to Siegfried, really made the most of its strategic location. Those trade routes we mentioned, they were key.
Economic clout.
Economic importance was definitely a catalyst. But yes, strategic marriages, political alliances, and a degree of military capability all played their part in this rise to power across Europe.
So they're actively building influence. And the duchy itself, it wasn't just the area of modern Luxembourg, was it? Sources say it expanded into parts of today's Belgium, Germany, France.
That's right. Through more alliances, clever diplomacy, they fostered trade, established Luxembourg as a real regional hub. Sometimes it involved treaties, sometimes strategic marriages, bringing new lands under their control. It wasn't always about fighting.
It sounds like the House of Luxembourg became a serious player on the European stage. You mentioned their influence growing from the late 13th century onwards.
Very much so. It's quite something how this relatively small territory produced figures who really mattered in Europe.
Like who?
Well, the big one is Henry VII. He becomes Holy Roman Emperor in 1312.
Wow, Holy Roman Emperor from Luxembourg. That puts them firmly on the map.
Absolutely. It dramatically boosted the family's status and Luxembourg's political weight. And then there's Charles IV, Henry's grandson.
What's his story?
He's known for strengthening the administration of the Holy Roman Empire and also for promoting culture, intellectual growth, sort of laying groundwork for the Renaissance in that part of Europe. So their impact went beyond just land grabbing.
Contributing to wider European developments.
Precisely. And regarding that territory, after becoming a duchy in 1354, they used their influence having members in these really high-ranking positions, emperors, kings, to secure more lands, marital alliances again, but also military campaigns when needed.
But those borders must have been pretty fluid back then. Lots of conflicts in Europe.
Oh, constantly shifting. Maintaining and expanding territory took immense diplomatic skill. It was a real balancing act, managing feudal ties, vassalage, choosing sides in bigger conflicts.
So medieval Luxembourg wasn't some quiet backwater. It was dynamic.
Not at all. It was all about political consolidation, dynastic ambition, cultural evolution, shaped by these counts and dukes. Siegfried's acquisition in 963 was the spark, but its central location made it a hub for trade, diplomacy, administration.
And Henry VII becoming emperor in 1312, a real high point.
Definitely. And you also get figures like John the Blind in the 14th century. He really embodies that whole chivalric ideal of the time.
The knightly king?
Kind of. His participation in European wars, famously dying at the Battle of Crécy in 1346, he became a legend.
A medieval hero with Luxembourg roots. But then things shift. Mid-15th century, Luxembourg gets absorbed into the Burgundian and Habsburg realms.
Yeah, that happens through those complex webs of shifting allegiances and, crucially, inheritance deals, dynastic politics. Luxembourg was strategically valuable, so bigger powers wanted it.
Okay, but what about life for ordinary people in medieval Luxembourg? It wasn't all emperors and battles, right? What was happening economically, socially?
Well, it was tied up with the feudal system, of course, but also its location on trade routes. Cities like Luxembourg City, Echternach, they became important commercial centers.
And religion played a big role.
Hugely important. Religious institutions, especially places like the Abbey of Echternach, were centers not just for spiritual life, but for culture and learning. Education, producing those incredible illuminated manuscripts.
Like medieval universities and art studios rolled into one. And the nobility. Sources say they were very influential, not just the top rulers.
Oh, yes. The wider nobility held enormous power. Landowners, military protectors. It was the feudal structure. And powerful families, including the House of Luxembourg itself, had influence stretching way beyond its borders, as we saw with the emperors.
So they held the power, but also drove the economy on their lands.
In a way, yes. Managing agriculture, organizing production, offering protection to peasants. And their castles, they weren't just homes, they were symbols of power, centers of defense.
And culture, too. Patrons of the arts.
Absolutely. They supported arts, music, religious institutions. They fostered cultural development, backed learning centers. They even got involved in administrative stuff, like helping to codify laws.
It sounds like Luxembourg, being at this crossroads, developed a really rich, blended culture during the Middle Ages.
That's a key takeaway. Its location meant constant exposure through trade, war, politics, leading to this mixing of ideas, customs, art styles. The church was central. Monasteries were hubs of learning and art. Those manuscripts really show that blend of local and outside styles.
And you can see it in the buildings, too, right? Romanesque Gothic churches, castles.
Definitely. The architecture tells a story. And castle building itself impacted local culture jobs, crafts, plus you had music, oral traditions, troubadours spreading stories. It all added up to a vibrant cultural scene.
Okay, so moving on, the Burgundian and Habsburg periods. Luxembourg gets drawn into these bigger empires. How did the Burgundian integration happen in the 15th century?
It started as usual with marriage alliances between the Luxembourg nobility and the Dukes of Burgundy. But the decisive moment was 1443. Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy, essentially acquired Luxembourg.
Acquired how?
Succession disputes, basically. He got the rights from Elizabeth of Görlitz. It was a strategic move, boosting Burgundian influence massively.
And what did Burgundian rule mean for Luxembourg itself? Was it all negative, losing autonomy?
It was a mixed bag. On the plus side, there was a flourishing of arts and culture tied into the Flemish Renaissance that the Burgundians championed. The economy grew too, with expanded trade and urban development.
But the downside?
Less local control. The Burgundians brought in more centralized administration. Power shifted away from the traditional Luxembourgish lords.
A trade-off, then. Culture and economy versus political autonomy. Then come the Habsburgs, 16th century. How did that happen?
Another key marriage. Mary of Burgundy married Maximilian of Austria, who was also Holy Roman Emperor, back in 1477. Eventually, this brought Luxembourg under Habsburg control, making it part of their huge empire.
One of the biggest players in Europe at the time.
Absolutely. And under them, Luxembourg became part of what was known as the Spanish Netherlands.
What was that period like?
It brought a degree of political stability, which was important because the Reformation and religious wars were tearing Europe apart. The Habsburgs were strongly Catholic and enforced that in Luxembourg, but it also meant being ruled from afar.
Distant rulers, not local ones. So these Burgundian and Habsburg eras really shaped Luxembourg, creating this mix of influences.
Definitely molded its political, cultural, economic path. And the integration into Burgundy, it wasn't just Philip showing up. The Treaty of Arras in 1435 kind of paved the way, aligning interests. Then 1443, the acquisition from Elizabeth of Görlitz. Diplomacy played a big part.
Ratified through agreements, feudal homage, not just force.
Right. And it led to those big administrative changes that moved towards central Burgundian authority, away from regional autonomy. But it also helped infrastructure, trade routes, brought in Burgundian customs, art.
And then the Habsburgs, after that 1477 marriage, part of the Spanish Netherlands, how different was that rule?
Well, again, distant rulers. And Habsburg administration meant things like higher taxes, conscription for their wars across Europe. Luxembourg got caught up in things like the 80 Years' War.
So benefits from being in the prosperous Spanish Netherlands, but also burdens like funding wars.
Exactly, a double-edged sword. And its location meant it was often caught in the middle of military campaigns. But culturally, it also soaked up those Renaissance influences spreading through Habsburg lands.
Okay, let's jump forward. The 19th century, a huge turning point. The Belgian Revolution of 1830. Luxembourg was part of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands then.
Correct. And that revolution in the South had a massive impact. It stirred up desires for autonomy within Luxembourg, too, fueled by similar economic issues and social grievances. It actually split Luxembourg internally.
How so?
Between the French-speaking areas, who felt closer to the Belgians, and the German-speaking parts, who were maybe more aligned with the Dutch crown.
A real internal division. And this gets sorted out by the Treaty of London in 1839. Sounds pivotal.
Hugely pivotal. This treaty establishes Luxembourg as a sovereign Grand Duchy. It settles the territory dispute. The western, French-speaking part goes to Belgium, setting the modern borders.
And crucially,
it formally recognized Luxembourg's independence and, very importantly, its perpetual neutrality.
So, smaller, but finally its own independent, neutral nation. Must have been tough, though, losing land and people.
Big challenges, for sure. But it set them on a new course. Modernization, restructuring the economy, and that neutrality, initially imposed by the big powers, became really central to Luxembourg's identity over time.
Let's dig into that Belgian Revolution a bit more. It wasn't just a sudden flare-up.
No, resentment against King William I had been building. Economic gaps between the industrial South and the North, religious divides, Catholic South, Protestant North, and cultural issues, French speakers feeling suppressed.
And Luxembourg got pulled in because
of its ties, administrative, territorial, to those southern provinces that were revolting. Rural Luxembourg, especially, felt connections to the Belgian cause, even if the cities tried to stay out initially.
So it was stuck in the middle. Netherlands connection, but sympathies with the Belgians. What happened right after Belgium declared independence?
Luxembourg's fate was really up in the air. It had this dual status, part of the German Confederation, but under the Dutch king. Very complex. The new Belgian government actually claimed all of Luxembourg.
Wow. But King William wouldn't let go.
No, he resisted. It created a real diplomatic standoff.
Leading to the Treaty of London. What were the key terms again?
Signed April 19th, 1839. Landmark stuff. It confirms Luxembourg as a sovereign Grand Duchy. The Dutch king remains Grand Duke, but in personal union, two separate states, same monarch. And crucially, perpetual neutrality is affirmed.
So it was a compromise hammered out by the European powers.
Essentially, yes. Balancing Dutch and Belgian interests. It partitioned Luxembourg French-speaking west to Belgium. The rest becomes the independent Grand Duchy.
creating the modern Luxembourg.
Sure.
And that neutrality was key. What were the long-term effects of the treaty?
It really laid the foundation for Luxembourg's future. Political, economic self-determination. It allowed them to carve out their own path, develop, stabilize, and neutrality shaped its whole diplomatic identity.
Okay, then World War I hits Europe, and Luxembourg, despite being neutral, gets occupied.
Yes, a violation of that neutrality guaranteed by treaty. Germany marched in August 1914.
Why? Just strategic location.
Primarily. It was a vital transit route for German forces heading west. Its neutrality wasn't enough to stop them.
So, occupied from day one.
Right.
How did the Germans run things?
Well, they controlled key functions, police, communications, but tried to keep up appearances, maintaining a sort of facade of respecting the Grand Ducal government. But the reality was, sovereignty was severely limited.
And the Luxembourgish people, how did they react? Any resistance?
Sources mention subtle forms of resistance, small acts of defiance, trying to preserve national identity. But with the German Oblate there, large-scale resistance was impossible.
And after the war, what were the big challenges?
Huge economic recovery needed. The war spurred faster industrialization, and the exposure to the outside world, it fueled social changes, a drive to modernize, strengthen national unity, build economic stability.
Let's look closer at that 1914 occupation. What did the Germans do immediately?
Priority one was military control, taking over the railways, communication lines to support their war effort on the Western Front. Plus, clamping down culturally censorship, suppressing dissent.
But you mentioned subtle resistance. What form did that take?
Mostly covert, non-violent stuff. Sabotage of infrastructure, maybe sharing intelligence with the Allies underground. Risky, but important for morale, for identity.
And post-war recovery, what were the key moves?
Reestablishing political stability under Grand Duchess Charlotte was vital, and economically integrating internationally. The big one was the Belgian-Luxembourg Economic Union in 1921.
BLEU. That helped trade, industry.
Massively, especially the steel industry, which was crucial for Luxembourg.
And politically. Any big changes?
Yeah, a 1919 referendum confirmed the monarchy, but also embraced democracy with a new constitution. Plus, you start seeing education reforms, early social security systems being set up, part of that broader modernization push.
Then, tragically, just 2 decades later, World War II, invaded again? Must have been devastating.
Profoundly so. May 10th, 1940. Neutrality meant nothing again. Part of Germany's blitzkrieg across Western Europe.
Strategic location again. Resources.
Both. Supply routes, iron ore. Luxembourg was valuable to the Nazi war machine.
And this occupation was much harsher, aimed at wiping out Luxembourgish identity.
Totally different scale. The government fled into exile. Nazi administrators took over, Gustav Semen being the main one. They imposed German law, German language. Ruthless assimilation was the goal.
And resistance, forced conscription, persecution.
All of it. Organized resistance movements emerged, but also forced conscription into the German army, horrific persecution, deportations to concentration camps, especially targeting the Jewish community.
A truly dark time. But liberation came eventually.
September 1944 by the Allies. Then began the long, hard road of reconstruction, reconciliation. It really showed the resilience of the people, and it absolutely cemented Luxembourg's post-war commitment to international cooperation, to peace.
Let's focus on that Nazi occupation more. Erasing Luxembourg as a nation was the explicit goal.
Absolutely. Swift takeover, then systematic integration into the Reich. Banning the language in public, in schools. Forcing young men into the Wehrmacht. Complete cultural erasure.
And beyond language and conscription.
Oh, yeah. Brutal racial laws targeting Jewish citizens, arrests, deportations to death camps, political opponents, anyone resisting prison, execution. But even then, an underground resistance fought back. Sabotage, propaganda, helping people escape.
Daily life must have been terrifying.
Constant fear, shortages, no freedom. Collaboration by some locals made it worse. Censorship, kids forced into Nazi schooling. But somehow, that Luxembourgish resilience held on.
And liberation in autumn 44. Overwhelming relief, I imagine.
Huge relief, yes. Primarily American troops pushing through, some fighting, but liberated by December. But that relief was mixed with the deep scars, communities destroyed, economy shattered, the trauma of persecution.
So post-war wasn't just about rebuilding bridges and buildings.
Far from it. Rebuilding institutions, dealing with the collaborators, that was tough. Restoring democracy quickly with the government in exile returning. Debates about reconciliation, but also symbolic recovery celebrations, reaffirming national identity.
And economic recovery.
Crucial. International help, especially the Marshall Plan, was key. revitalizing industries like iron and steel. And Luxembourg immediately jumped into those new post-war organizations, determined to be part of a new cooperative Europe.
Which brings us nicely to the post-war era, a period of incredible transformation.
Really remarkable. From occupation to, well, a symbol of recovery and progress, huge economic resurgence, modernizing, innovating, diversifying away from just steel into new areas like financial services.
They were right in there at the start of European integration.
Absolutely. Founding member of the Benelux Union, founding member of the European Coal and Steel Community, right at the heart of European unification from day one, shaping policies. It showed incredible adaptability, grabbing opportunities, building partnerships.
And that link between post-war growth and the rise of the financial sector seems really strong.
It's key, really taking off from the early 80s. They used their location, smart regulation, to become this major global financial center, especially for investment funds.
Huge impact on jobs, public finances.
Massive, funded a high standard of living, but yeah, it also created a vulnerability to global market swings, which is why diversification is still important.
And their role in the EU itself, particularly around the Maastricht Treaty in 1991, they seem to play a big part for a small country.
They really did. When Luxembourg held the EU presidency, they proposed the famous pillar structure for the EU.
The three pillars: community, foreign policy, justice, home affairs.
That's the one. It was a way to balance integrating things under the EU umbrella versus keeping some areas more intergovernmental, between national governments, reflecting that tension between pooling sovereignty and keeping national control.
So Luxembourg shaping the very architecture of the modern EU.
Pretty much. There were some doubts from bigger countries initially, but Luxembourg's idea won out. It showed their influence, shaping a more integrated but flexible EU.
Which leads us to modern Luxembourg. Still small, but influential. How would you sum it up today?
It's this fascinating mix, isn't it? Tradition and hypermodernity, a major center for finance, EU governance, still deeply committed to the European project. Its location and neutrality still give it a role as a mediator sometime.
And politically. Seems stable, progressive?
Very much so. Constitutional monarchy, parliamentary democracy, big focus on social welfare, sustainability, innovation. Still a financial giant, but actively trying to grow high-tech startups, diversify.
And that cultural identity, so tied to being multilingual.
Absolutely. Luxembourgish, French, German, all official. It reflects that history is a crossroads. It's a vibrant culture, embracing history, but also very open and contemporary.
Let's just quickly recap the political journey to get here. It's been quite a ride since the 19th century.
It has. Losing territory, fighting for autonomy. That 1867 treaty confirming sovereignty was key. Then universal suffrage in 1919, the referendum keeping the monarchy, establishing the modern constitutional setup.
And the world wars were defining experiences politically.
Absolutely shaped their direction, led directly to that strong commitment to international cooperation, being a founding member of the EU precursors.
And today, a stable, multi-party democracy tackling modern issues.
Exactly. Things like environmental sustainability, digital innovation, managing multiculturalism. Those are the big themes now.
That multilingualism is fascinating. It's not just about speaking languages. There are deeper identity issues.
There are. Sources point to, ongoing discussions about the role of Luxembourgish itself as the national language. Historically, French and German dominated writing. Luxembourgish was more spoken day to day. Triglossia.
So, efforts to promote Luxembourgish more formally.
Yeah, debates about standardizing it, pushing its use, especially since WWII and more intensely since the 70s. Partly driven by migration, asking questions about language, identity, citizenship, integrating it into education, its role in cultural unity. It's complex.
How people, especially young people, relate to the language reflects these ongoing dynamics.
Precisely. Its symbolic weight versus its practical use day to day.
Now, Luxembourg's role in the EU. Clearly disproportionate influence for its size.
Remarkably so. As a founder, always pushing for deeper integration. Active in institutions, hosting key bodies like the European Court of Justice, parts of the Parliament.
So not just members, but hosts and active shapers.
Definitely. A strong voice on policy, especially economic and monetary stuff, pushing for stability. You see it reflected in their own laws aligning with the EU. And that multilingual, multicultural society kind of embodies the EU's unity and diversity motto.
Being a founder was a very deliberate post-war choice then, rooted in wanting peace.
Absolutely. Joining the coal and steel community in 51, then the EEC, it was all about cooperation after the wars. Showed their strategic vision, their belief in unity, even as a small nation.
And they've stayed central to the EU's evolution ever since.
Yeah, hosting institutions, staying proactive. They're a cornerstone, really.
And economically, their contribution is mainly through that huge financial sector.
That's the driver. Leading in Europe for investment fund assets, second globally after the US, I think. An entire ecosystem has grown around it, lawyers, accountants, consultants.
Generating huge tax revenues for Luxembourg.
Significant revenues, yes. Though, as we said, that creates exposure to global financial ups and downs. Those shocks test stability, highlighting why that sophisticated cluster is key for resilience, constantly adapting regulations.
Which brings us neatly to the challenges facing Luxembourg today. That reliance on finance being number one.
It's a major consideration. It brought wealth but also vulnerability. So economic diversification is the big strategic challenge.
How do they tackle that, given they don't have vast natural resources?
It's a focused strategy, strengthening existing pillars, especially finance itself, tweaking regulations to stay competitive for fund administration, being nimble with global markets, and fostering innovation within finance. Plus, linking education tightly to industry needs.
Makes sense. Play to your strengths, but innovate within them. What about social challenges? High living standards, lots of immigration. That must create pressures.
It does. Nearly half the population are immigrants. That brings challenges around integration. Language diversity. 3 official languages can complicate access to services, making sure access is equitable.
Integration and language barriers affecting jobs, education.
They can, yeah. And housing affordability is a massive issue. Prices have soared, hitting lower-income groups hard, risking social division.
And pressure on infrastructure, healthcare, transport.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Population growth, urbanization. It strains everything. Healthcare, childcare, transport, elder care. Plus, concerns about youth unemployment, maintaining social cohesion with growing inequality. It requires constant policy work, investment.
So even a successful nation like Luxembourg has its share of complex modern problems.
Of course. Balancing growth, social inclusion, environmental responsibility. That's the ongoing task for pretty much everyone in the 21st century. Luxembourg's no different.
Well, looking back at the whole story, it's quite something. From that small medieval county to today's influential nation, navigating huge shifts, yet keeping that identity.
It really is. Its history as that cultural and political crossroads shaped it. Its evolution from farming to steel to finance shows incredible adaptability. And that commitment to Europe has been constant since the war.
So modern Luxembourg is like a microcosm of globalization. Tradition, innovation, openness all mixed together.
That sums it up well. And maybe the most inspiring thing is how this small nation, through sheer resilience and smart choices, has consistently managed to have such a significant positive impact way beyond its borders. It shows how understanding your past really can guide your future.